Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Security by Design webinar series. Joining Chip and myself today is Trevor Young, our Chief Product Officer. Trevor is an entrepreneurial product and technology leader who loves working with small teams of domain experts who excel at collaborative problem solving and can execute a great product strategy. Thanks for joining us, Trevor.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here, guys.
Great.
So in today's presentation, we'll be talking about how training teams for secure development can educate their stakeholders on how to initiate security by design. We'll also learn the importance of embedding security champions within the team to drive cultural shift, and just get a perspective from Trevor and how threat modeling can deliver products that are secure by default to market.
So while we get started with our first question, Chip, I think that's with you around the security maturity model.
Yeah, so let's talk about security maturity model, as the needs for organizations are not uniform. So organizations might be the initial phase when we're looking to create processes, and currently decisions might be a bit more ad hoc, versus organizations with the further end of the spectrum, and they'll really be looking to optimize their existing processes. So my question for you, Trevor, is what is the security problem to solve if an organization is in the initial phase versus if they're in the further along within their maturity model?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chip. And we see quite a bit of different scenarios across the spectrum in the customers and the prospects that we deal with. Usually it sort of buckets into less about the size of the company, but more about their compliance needs. And that sort of drives their maturity in the industry that they're in. So sometimes you'll find a very large company with, thousands of developers doing billions of dollars, but they're in a lightly regulated industry. And so their security needs and their budget and the resources they have are lower. And so in those situations, and that can also span to customers that are much smaller companies as well in a highly regulated organization. But generally it comes down to sort of where they are in that journey. And when they're early in the journey, often it's very new, and they might have a compliance officer or a small number of people on the security team. But really the development teams, the people that are building the products, are the front line, and they're the ones that really need to know how to secure their products and what processes to put in place. So generally, what we've seen has worked best in those situations is starting them off with some really fundamental education. So just getting them up to a point of understanding, why is this important? Why did they need to be secure and compliant? And then helping them understand how to actually go about implementing those. They don't usually have a lot of tools at the resources, and they often don't have a lot of time to put into it. So the really important thing there is helping them to focus on the absolute critical things that they need to address, and then slowly improving that. So, you usually want them to just basically understand the basics and the fundamentals and what's really important, and make sure that they implement those things, as opposed to trying to roll out a really comprehensive security process with, lots of tools and resource and expertise that they don't usually have access to.
I think it's a good point because you think about security processes equates to business value. So I think it's really helping them move further along the spectrum, and always education is key for that. But let's say the larger enterprise is like, all right, I'm more of optimization, like you said, maybe more in industries, like we have our processes in place. What recommendations would you have for them?
Yeah, so a lot of the times when you have like industries that are very highly regulated, like finance or health tech and things like that, they usually invest fairly heavily into security, both in resources, processes, and tooling. So their goal is really risk mitigation. They want to make sure that there's no breaches, and then their data is not being compromised. They generally already have a team with experience. They've had some level of training. And oftentimes they've implemented some of the sort of early processes. So like penetration testing, for example, is done by almost everyone. It's generally a requirement in most industries. Oftentimes they'll do application security testing, and that's where we tend to find people have sort of reached, and they usually find that that's not enough, and they're unsure of where to go next. And so what we've seen as a theme is shifting left. And so really sort of moving the security knowledge and more closer to the design stages. Generally, the earlier you catch some of these risks and mitigate them, the less it costs you to mitigate them after the fact, and the better security that you've got. So for some of those mature organizations, often it's really about making sure that they understand sort of what they're overall trying to measure, and then helping them measure that. and then looking at where are the areas where they need to expand. And so again, when they're looking to shift left, often you're trying to move them from considering security after they've released something in the testing phases, when code has already been written and vulnerabilities or risks may have already been introduced, and trying to get them to think about that earlier. And so part of that is still around training and education, but it's more around the advanced topics and techniques around education and securing things, as opposed to the basics and the foundations of it. And then the other really key part of it is really disseminating that information to the front lines, to those development teams, the DevOps teams, the product managers, the architects, people that are actually building all of the technology, making sure that they understand how to run these processes. What often becomes really challenging is when you have a security team trying to enforce some of these controls on the development teams. If they don't understand why they're doing it, they're not going to be motivated to do it. If they're just getting tickets in their queue and they don't even know what to do with them, that creates a lot of friction. Other things that don't work is gating processes. Again, if you say, hey, you can't release this product until all of these checkboxes have happened, they just find ways to get around that. They find loopholes and they try to push it through. And that's even worse, because then the security teams think that things are happening, but they're not aware of what's happening. And so really changing that culture, getting closer alignment between the security teams and the development teams, helping them educate those development teams, and then finding processes that really work within to their existing workflow. So the more you can automate things, the more that you can take off of the plate of the development teams, the better it is for them. The more you can educate them, and the more that you can have that collaboration between security teams and development teams, the better that you're going to have that opportunity to mitigate those risks moving forward and deliver things faster without these long gating processes put in place.
Trevor, I want to go back to what you said about compliance and sort of that checkbox use case. I think for some organizations, especially as you said, maybe they're early in their maturity cycle, this is commonly a first step for them towards like a security by design approach. Can you talk a little bit more maybe about like what you've heard? I know you were just at a CISO roundtable where this was kind of discussed. Maybe you can share that a little bit of that with us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we really consider, we focus on security by design, and we consider compliance by design as a subset of that. So it's really all the same, whether it's privacy or whether it's regulatory compliance for a particular industry. And we do notice a pattern, and sometimes it's related to maturity, but in some cases there are companies who they just have to be compliant. So they have to be PCI compliant if you're in the payments industry, or you have to be FDA compliant in other industries. And so sometimes they'll treat it as a checkbox exercise where it's just, let's do the minimum thing possible to check that box so the regulators are off our backs and we can continue to operate as a business. And that's fine. That works for some people. It obviously introduces a higher degree of risk if you're doing the minimum thing possible. But what we found with some of the more successful companies in more mature industries, they really lean into that. And so not only do they treat compliance again as something that they want their development teams to understand, they really want to help them understand why they're doing this, why it's important, and how it impacts the product. And some even treat that as a differentiator in the market. And so, for example, we've talked with customers who really lean into it, and they try to make sure that like they have the most privacy centric product that's out there. That's something that's really important for banks or anybody that stores personally financial information. Anybody that's using sort of manufacturing equipment that's used by lots of public infrastructure, again, you want to make sure that that can't be hacked. You can't disrupt that. And so companies that are really focused on compliance, they tend to escalate that, and they use it as a key differentiator in their markets, and it shows. I mean, even Apple does this. They really take a privacy centric approach, and people appreciate that, and they end up buying those products because they want to make sure that their personal identification and their personal information is secure. And so that's the sort of spectrum that we tend to see. Is there's sort of the folks that are more sort of compliance by checkbox and they do the minimum, and then there's ones that really lean into it. And both are fine approaches. Depends on your business model, depends on how you're trying to position your company. But certainly we tend to promote the ones where it's like really educate your team, help them understand why they're doing this, and then lean into that and use it as a differentiator against your competitors who might suffer more breaches as a result in the future, and then you can double down on it.
Yeah, those are all good calls. I think two things that jump out to me is that your point on it is a competitive differentiator, is that this is something that customers do value. And I think you talked about securing person identifiable information. I know too, in that line, you talked about shifting left as well, is that the term security by design has become more prevalent. I'm curious, just from your take, what is the industry definition? Because I know a lot has to align more with that customer experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very sort of broad definition, and people kind of interpret it in different ways. The way that we certainly interpret it, and the way that I think a lot of others do, is when you look at the software development lifecycle, and if you extend that into security, there's a common nomenclature called DevSecOps, or the DevSecOps lifecycle, which in a continuous development process, it really outlines the different stages of planning or designing your product, implementing it, which is usually software development, building it, testing it, releasing it, deploying it. And so security by design for us, and for most people we've talked to in the industry, is really in those early stages. So it's in the planning stage and it's in the designing stage. And most people develop software in a continuous flow now. And so it's not just when you're architecting a brand new product that it happens, but every release, every time you go through that cycle, you go through that stage. And so generally what we see in practice is that it comprises of training, which is a really fundamental thing. If you're going to build something new or build a new feature, you have to understand how to build it. You need to know the technology, and we include security as part of that. Whatever you're using to build that's new, the components you're using, you need to know how to secure those components. The other part is threat modeling, and so this is a common exercise, and it generally happens in the design stage as well. And that's really asking for simple questions, which is, what is it you're working on, either as part of this product or part of this release? What could possibly go wrong? So you really do that assessment of what are the potential risks? What are we going to do about it? And that's where, you have some guidance and best practices, and usually requirements. So when you're writing the requirements of what to build, how do you make those secure requirements? How do you make sure that those are compliant as well? And then the coding part. And so whatever you can do to provide, best practices, policies, sample applications, or secure components that are secure out of the box, those are really the components that we see as being part of that security by design. And then you can apply the same thing to compliance as well. So compliant by design, privacy by design, security by design, all of those activities would happen in that initial design stage, and then generally in a continuous flow. So whatever your release cadence is, however often you build new features into those products, you would repeat those on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I think it's all good calls. And I think too, we talk about threat modeling and more shift left and design phases. We sometimes think about, oh, the cost of avoidance of rework. But I think one thing jumped out to me, you talked about security should be a requirement. It really, my thought is, what's the customer, your end user? Because maybe they don't fully understand their security needs. But I think too, it's something that companies do have to start thinking about, is this should be a requirement for just not a differentiator for us, but also what's inherent value to their end users.
Yeah. The end users, I think, are getting more savvy from that perspective. Certainly with privacy, it's in the news constantly. I'm sure that almost everybody has been affected by a breach and their data has been leaked at some point. They get those notifications. And so it's definitely coming front and center in the customers' minds, whether you have enterprise customers or whether you have end users as customers. So it's definitely an important part of the overall process. But you're right, if they don't necessarily ask for it as a feature until actually something bad has happened, and then it becomes a high priority for both the organization, or they move to another product and another company who did prioritize that as part of their product development process.
I wanted to come back to something you said earlier around compliance and, maybe like what might be a good first step for an organization that's looking to embrace security by design. Can you talk to us maybe about like what might be good actionable guidance for organizations like that?
Yeah. So sorry, just as a pause, I'm just trying to find the notes around that. Is this sort of the champion sort of answer? Or are we on a different question?
The importance of finding training that sticks.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so give me 2 seconds. We'll have to cut this out. But...
That's okay.
Sorry. Okay, here we go. All right, we'll hit reset there. Yeah, so in terms of, getting started with, security and compliance, as I mentioned earlier, training, that fundamental training is often the best piece. And, typically you have security teams and then you have the development teams, and the developers are really the ones that need to understand that. Security teams are generally sort of advising and providing guidance, or they might have consultants that are coming in. But at the end of the day, the developers, the DevOps teams, the ones that are actually building the code and shipping the software need to understand that. And there's lots of different ways that they learn. We've run a number of different surveys in the market, and we have some stats that really just highlight how little time people allocate towards training, particularly security training. And they don't necessarily like it. It's often seen as sort of an exercise that they're being told to do. Once a year, you have to complete security awareness training. And it's just simply because there's no time and there's not a lot of motivation. And so there's a couple key things there. One, you really need to have sort of the culture to be reset. You need to have that buy-in from the executive level on down. You know, if your leader or your manager is saying, you got to take this, just finish it and let me know when you're done, and then you can move on with your work, they're never going to treat it as a priority. And so they're not going to put much effort into it. If they are able to understand why it's important and they understand the reasons behind it, it's a little bit more motivating. They also need to have that training sort of that fits into their daily schedule, right? So, you know, somebody that is asked to take a day-long or a week-long course and get certified, or somebody that you know, has to interrupt their daily work life, it's really difficult for them to find the time to do that. So you really want to deliver the training to them either through the tools or through the mechanisms that they interact with on a day-to-day basis. And you want to give it to them in a format that's easy for them to consume as part of their activities. And so, you know, what we've seen is really, really helpful is giving them very short sort of bits of micro modules that are relevant to what they happen to be doing on their day-to-day basis. So if they're being asked to secure a particular component, you can give them some training, 5-10 minute videos that explain why this is necessary, give them some code samples that they can actually copy and paste or incorporate it into their development lifecycle. Conversely, you know, you could ask them to go and take a course and finish this over the course of several weeks and get certified and then ask them to do this, but that's not how most people work. And so we see both spectrums. It really depends on your business model, but finding training that really works for the team, making it a little bit more hands-on, giving it to them when it's relevant to what they're working on is what we've found to be the most effective. And so if you can align that with, again, what they're working on and fit it into their daily tools and their daily activities, we find that tends to be a lot more effective. Because they just don't have the time to spend hours a week or even days in a month just dedicated to training, and they don't retain it, to be honest. Often they'll take it, they'll finish the quiz, and then they move on. A month later, they forget about it. So if you just give it to them in bits and bytes as needed in an on-demand type of a fashion, we found that to be much more effective.
You know, one thing you talked like the top-down approach is important, but I also think you also talked about the bottom-up one too. It's the micro modules, all these other tools. Any examples that you have seen from customers that do work, maybe that other companies can take and institute?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen, certainly with some of the more mature organizations where they have, where they already have sort of some infrastructure in place, is the concept of a security champions program. And so the notion of a security champion is essentially where you pick somebody within an existing development team and you train them to be sort of that local representative. So it's not necessarily an application security expert, but it's a developer who already knows how they're developing code. They know the team, they know the processes. And what we've found is that that's a lot easier to take somebody that's already part of that team and train them and get them up to speed so that they're learning the basics. And then they act as a bit of a coach to the rest of the team. And they have a little bit additional accountability and responsibility there. But you call them that champion, and they're sort of the go-to person. They usually have a strong collaborative sort of cadence with the security teams in general to keep them in the loop and get a little bit of guidance from them. But they're sort of taking that and becoming the coach of the team. And we've seen that applied at a number of large organizations and even some smaller organizations. The thing about that is that it can work well if you have a small team and you just pick someone to do it, but it can also scale to very large teams where you have thousands of developers across an organization. So again, I think a lot of that also has to come from the culture. You really need to get that buy-in from the executive level because you need to give them the time to be trained. You need to have a team in place. You need to create a program structure and roll that out. And again, generally starting one team at a time and making sure you nail that before you scale it across others has been the most effective approach that we've seen. Companies that sort of come in, they have a budget, they create this really comprehensive program, and then they say go, and they try to apply that across everywhere, generally fails. You usually get some teams that are rejecting it. Some teams might do it okay, but it sort of goes off in different directions and it's really hard to control. So it's definitely more effective to start slow and then build your way up. Once you've gotten to a point where you see, okay, this is really effective, we've seen 3 or 4 different teams adopt this and are off to the races, then you can start to scale it. But that early stages is really critical, because if you get it wrong and it's treated the wrong way, then the developers will just think of it as something that is a real pain and another thing that they have to do that they don't want to do. Whereas if you get them to the point where they understand it, and you can find people that are really motivated to move their career in that direction and are excited about security, those are the ideal candidates to designate as champions within a team.
Yeah, I think that change management piece is important, especially early phases, because it has to be value to everyone involved. And it's like you said, you just can't roll something out if there's not cross-company buy-in.
Exactly.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about maybe like the relationship between people, process, and technology, and how those kind of work together, especially in a company that's trying to bear and maintain like a security by design culture. Um, could you talk a little bit about maybe like how you've seen SD elements, like our own product, like work in such a scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think oftentimes we get a little bit too focused on the tooling, and people see lots of great ways to automate some of these things, but it really does come down to the people, the process, and the technology. And so I think, again, I talked a little bit about culture, but you really need to make sure that you've got people that are motivated and that are passionate about this, instead of just trying to assign it to somebody that really has no interest in it. And there's that's probably one of the biggest problems we've seen, both with champions programs and people trying to really elevate internal people into a new role and take on something new. There's a huge shortage of cybersecurity experts out there today. And so it often is the best path to take somebody internally. And if you can identify those people that are passionate and that are motivated, oftentimes, in most cases, it does help if you have the budget and the resources to bring on external consultants. If you are selecting specific technologies, you really want to make sure that the companies that are offering those technologies can support you through it. SaaS and sort of self-service models are really great, but when you're in those early stages, you really need somebody that can handhold you through that onboarding process, help you structure that program, somebody that's done it before. Like I said, those are really hard people to find in the industry. They're very expensive and they're very rare. But if you have organizations that are offering some of those technology and tools to help you with it, make sure that they've got that level of support for you and they're going to work with you and they're committed to making that program a success across the board. The technology is obviously a really important part of it. Security and application security in particular has gone through quite a transformation over the years. It was very much sort of an isolated, siloed scenario where you'd have these experts, consultants come in, work in a box and then produce some output and say, here's what you need to do, throw it over the fence, and their job was done. You want to basically get that collaboration a lot closer. You want them working, more like coaches and advisors within the organization as opposed to an external consultant. And the more they have the ability to sort of work with those teams and get them over those hurdles, then I think the better chances of success that you've got. The last part on the technology front is there's a ton of tools out there. There's probably 100 different tools that all claim to do lots of things that are overlapping with each other. So it's quite a challenge to pick the ones that really work right and are effective. But one of the things that you want to consider is the ability to fit those into your processes and automate as much as possible. So looking for tools that have really strong APIs, the ability to integrate with other tools in your existing ecosystem, the ability to have plugins, extensions, whatever it is. You want that level of flexibility so that if you do have a team that's working towards a process that fits for them, then they can automate as much as possible and they can streamline it into their existing processes. And that's a lot of sort of what it comes down to, is when you combine, the technology that's really flexible and robust and can integrate easily with people that understand how to use it and can collaborate with the teams that are ultimately going to end up receiving it, and then moving that and fitting that into existing processes or slightly modified processes so that you're not disrupting those teams as little as possible. That's sort of the sweet spot that you want to get to. And it takes people a lot of time to get there, and the tools are evolving, the people and the experience is increasing. So I think we're getting better at it, but we're still a long ways away. So you do need to be very selective when you're looking at, the tools and the people you're working with and how you refine some of the processes that you have in place today to fit within that paradigm.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. I guess like it really brings home like how important collaboration is across, like the whole process and how, even security by design doesn't just mean like at the beginning phase. It really is just like built in all throughout, like across that spectrum. So yeah, thanks for that. Um, Pause one sec. I think we've covered all of the questions.
Yeah.
Um, like the only thing I would say is like, Trevor, do you think we can bring in maybe ask you a question about um maybe like you've talked about this already before, like but AI and maybe how we're using AI in like in our own like in our own product or like how we're training like our own yeah like for security content. I'm not sure how we would phrase that question, but
Are you talking more of like how we're using it to like enhance our product or enhance companies can enhance their own product?
maybe
Yeah,
within our own product and because it's like there's sort of this fear, right, like with AI and security and kind of not being able to reconcile that like it like a learning like a large language can be secure actually. So I don't know how we can bring that in maybe just as one question, whether it's even our own future roadmap or whether it's like just like aspirational at this point. Not sure how you want to phrase it. We can also bypass it entirely, but I think
yeah,
it'll
you can.
right.
I can take a crack at it if you split it into two and just say, hey, like AI is a hot topic and ask about like how are you seeing people using it in their products and what are the risks, or how you see people incorporating it as part of their security processes. And then after that, if you want to ask like, how are we thinking about using it, I can try to talk to both. We can always edit it out or cut it
Yeah,
afterwards. It doesn't
sounds
go there. But
okay. Chip, do you want to take one of the questions and then I'll like I can take the first one, you can take the second one, and then we'll wrap. I guess we can do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that sounds good.
So I will ask the question of how are you seeing tech companies use AI to improve their product? Sorry, does that make sense? Like or how are
how are they integrating them? How are they thinking of using them? Anything like that, I think is good.
Do you think that a natural progression then is like we're talking about security gaps? Do you think then it's the time to like we can talk about our product, what we're doing, but do you think a progression into is like what we are doing as well to help them secure? Like
Yeah,
you
I can
talk
cover
about
both.
sounds like this those
yeah.
are really good things early. So maybe it's like we can do that,
I think I think that's a good one. Chip, like do you want like that might be a better fleshed out question if you want to take that one and then
yeah, I
maybe
can take. So do we want to do then all three then of like you ask like the more general, the what we're doing to bring value to customers, and then still ask about our product, or do you want to keep it to like what we are doing to help secure your design and deployment of AI products?
I think the last question, like if we want to do that, it'll be more kind of like uh practical for people to hear it and sort of
Okay, yeah, yeah. Don't need to put you on the spot on the product strategy itself.
Oh, that's
So
okay.
yeah.
I've talked about it a couple. We talked about it in the webinar. We talked about it at a roundtable. So I think I'll try to stick to that. I won't reveal anything that I
okay.
haven't already said publicly, but we can always cut it
Mm-hmm.
after if it doesn't work. So ask away.
Okay. All right. So we'll get started. So Chip, you'll do that, and then I'll just do our outro and our thanks at the end. So
You'll
we'll
do
get
the first question, right? Like, just want to make sure of like what companies are seeing right now. Just like as I mean, we can skip. I can just talk about, I can just ask that question about like the value we're bringing.
yeah, maybe more of the value we're bringing. Like let's
Okay.
ask. Okay.
Okay. All
All right.
right. Yeah. Okay. So I think going back to security by design, I think additional challenge we're seeing is the proliferation of AI and especially generative AI and more use of large language models. What are we doing, or what's the value we can bring to companies to help them securely design and deploy their own AI products?
Yeah, that's a great question. This has been a hugely hot topic. I think everybody's aware of it, but we've had a lot of our customers asking about it. We have customers from finance to chip manufacturing to automotive, and it's pervasive. It's across everything. And with the launch of OpenAI's GPT-3 and 4 and large language models in general, everybody's been on top of this. It's both a huge opportunity for customers and for us, but it's also a huge threat and a risk because it's very largely new and not well understood. And certainly the threats and the vulnerabilities are not well understood either. And so, we get a lot of people that are asking us to sort of help them with that. So, it spans the spectrum of sort of safety and privacy and risk. There's all kinds. There's lots of people that are not sure what they're giving up and if their data, proprietary data, is being used to train some of these larger language models. There's copyright issues, there's prompt injections, and so it's a very early in sort of the stage, but we have a team of researchers. Most of them have PhDs, and they're dedicated full time to researching how the best ways we can help support people secure their products and their applications. And they've been jumping on this. It's not only exciting for them, but it's a brand new space, and so there's a lot of areas to explore. So we, as part of our product offering, have a security library that includes threats, vulnerabilities, weaknesses, countermeasures, code samples, everything a development and security team needs to make sure they're secured. And so we typically start in three areas. So we look at code, cloud, and container, and then compliance. Compliance is one area where this is going to be huge. There's already some acts in the EU and the UK. Canada and the US and other places in North America are sort of following suit. So there's a couple that are leading the way, and we're making sure that we understand what teams need to do to be compliant and be within the regulatory boundaries to release their products in different geographies around the world. But that's still really building up, and so we're keeping an eye on it. We're releasing some of it early. The other area is just sort of large language models in general and generative AI. There are some dominant sort of technologies that are surfacing, particularly OpenAI, how you deploy those models, how you train those models. We tend to look at the industry experts, and we work with them in a lot of cases. So NIST in the US, as well as OWASP, which is a foundation that's generally on top of this. So we're starting to include some of that content and some of that guidance within our own library so that our customers can benefit from that. So if they have indicated that they're using some of these technologies, we can help identify what some of the big risks are, and then we try to provide some guidance and sample solutions in terms of how to mitigate those risks. But it's rapidly changing. This stuff is coming out, and massive new releases on a month-over-month basis. So our team is pretty much working around the clock. There's tons of information out there, and they're trying to sift through it. We've also done some collaborative meetings with our customers to understand how they're using it, how they're implementing it, and what they really need the most guidance on. But it's pretty much green field, and so people have to be cautious. They have to make sure, again, that they educate themselves on this. And so we're also looking to include some training material for development teams and security teams that will help them understand that fundamental stuff. And then we'll continue to offer more advanced levels of training and build out our content library there, so that we're trying to follow where people are most using some of these technologies, and then again focus on where the biggest risks are. What are the critical things they need to be aware of, so at least they can go into some of this product development eyes open and do whatever we can on the people side as well to support them in those journeys.
We want to say thank you to Trevor for joining us today and sharing his perspective on security by design. If this was helpful to you and you'd like to access more content from us, please visit securitycompass.com/resources.
Great. Thanks. It was great to be here, guys.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Chip.